I believe it is afternoon. I believe it is afternoon for everyone on the webcast here right now. And if it's evening, I say welcome and good evening to you. Thanks for joining us today to talk about copyright review process and access policies in HathiTrust. We've got a lot of different institutions on the webcast today. I want to thank those of you who have set up conference rooms at your home to set up conference rooms so that you can have multiple participants taking part in this today. That's very much appreciated. It's meant that we've been able to add more people to the webcast. As Melissa was saying, as we were waiting to start, we are making the executive decision to mute and to disable the video for all of the participants today, except for the presenters. Our experience has been when we have this many people on the webcast, managing the conversation flow or ensuring that there's not extraneous background noise is a little bit challenging when we don't do that. So I hope you understand, and you can take advantage of the chat icon that's on the right of the screen to type in questions, and we'll pause for questions throughout this webcast. I also want to say about as far as extraneous noise goes, I sit next to a very loud atrium here in this library, and sometimes people decide to stand in that atrium and shout, and it's a great funnel for noise. So I apologize if you hear shouting in the background. It's really not dissent. It's just enthusiastic undergraduates in the Shapiro Undergraduate Library, University of Michigan. So if you don't know me, I'm Mike Furlow. I'm the executive director of HathiTrust. I've been with the organization since 2014, almost 2 years, which is really hard for me to believe. This is a fantastic job. I really love working for HathiTrust. I love working with all the members, and I love it because we tackle really substantive problems that have existed and dogged us in libraries for a very long time. So this webcast actually, I think, will give you an insight into how we try to tackle some of those dogged problems that we've been dealing with, in particular around determining copyright status of works that we would like to digitize and make available. So I will let Christina introduce herself, and then we'll go through the webcast.
Certainly. I'm Christina Eden. I've been with the Copyright Review Program since about 2012, although I was following it while I was still working in interlibrary loan. I did have knowledge of it. I was excited about it. So I've been working with the reviewers. I love working with them. I've helped manage the training program, design our remote online training, and I also do like data assessment and our process management. So that's what I do.
And Christina will talk all about most of that later on in this afternoon. So let's go ahead and jump in. I want to give you a quick preview of the outline for today. I would say there are two main goals we have for this afternoon's presentation, and one is to give you some clearer sense of our policies on access and copyright, how copyright affects our access policies, and then some looks at how we have preliminarily done copyright determinations using bibliographic data. Then Christina will step in. She'll talk about the Copyright Review Management System project, the CRMS project that was grant funded by IMLS and has been the primary driver of copyright review for HathiTrust materials for the last 8 years. We'll go into some detail on that. I'll come back and talk a little bit about the future, and we will take time for questions after my speech, after my presentation, after Christina's, and at the very end. Okay. So I will now just jump right in and talk to you a little bit about HathiTrust and the collection. I always start almost any presentation I give about HathiTrust with this slide because I want to emphasize to people that HathiTrust is known as a preservation service. Many of our users, our faculty, our students, our independent researchers and members of the public know us as a digital library, as a site where you can go and find a whole lot of really incredible and useful and interesting stuff. The long tail is ever present in HathiTrust collections. And it is true, those are things that we do, but I think more importantly to emphasize here is that we're an organization. And we're an organization made up of the member libraries who are taking part in this call today. There's over 100, actually it's a little over 110 now that we have. And because of the aggregation of materials that we have been able to pull together, and because of the size of our membership, we're able to undertake a number of programs collaboratively that individually we would all have really great difficulty undertaking on our own. So I think of what we do as providing collective solutions to collection management issues, among many other things. And I think the copyright review projects are a great example of applying collective action to a collection management issue. So this is the membership. I won't leave this on screen for very, very long. I believe we have someone from our Spanish member in Madrid with us this afternoon, and if so, hello, thank you for joining. Uh, Overall, the membership is largely North American, and it's mostly U.S. We have 4 Canadian members. We have a member in Spain. I mentioned the Complutense de Madrid, also the American University of Beirut, and the University of Queensland in Australia. So it's very North American heavy, and there's some reason for that, given that we started in North America, and we are really basing a lot of what we do with copyright and have to on U.S. copyright law because that's where we're organized. So the collection itself has really grown significantly over the last 8 years since HathiTrust was founded. We are this shy of 14 million volumes in the HathiTrust collection today. I think that within the next several weeks, we should be able to surpass 14 million. Of that 14 million volumes, that corresponds to just under 7 million unique book titles and 369,000 unique serial titles. And I should clarify that when we count monographs, we count serials, we're talking about what the catalog record tells us about the item. So if it says it's a serial, we count it as a serial. We also have over 712,000 U.S. federal documents in the collection. We identify those also using bibliographic data. And all of those are open for public viewing. And of those, they are a smaller portion of the 5.5 million volumes that we have that are open in the collection. The other thing to emphasize is that the collection, as you know it, is mostly stuff that's been published, and it's mostly stuff that's been bound, and it's stuff that's been digitized from library collections. Now, it doesn't mean that you won't occasionally find a manuscript that was on microfilm that was printed out, bound in a library, and scooped up into a mass digitization program. In HathiTrust, I've seen several of those myself, but for the most part, we're really focused on the published literature that libraries, and North American libraries in particular, have been collecting over the last 100+ years. So we get collections from our members. All collections are added to HathiTrust voluntarily by the membership. It is not a requirement that members add collections, but we do encourage it. The collections that have come to HathiTrust have come from multiple sources, the primary ones being Google. The second most significant one is material scanned by Internet Archive, and then local, by which I mean material scanned in your own house with another vendor, in partnership with another organization. And so when we accept material from members, we apply verification and validation processes to it, and we place the responsibility for production of the content, responsibility for the content and the metadata, both on the members themselves because they're closest to that material. So we aggregate metadata that members collect, or rather submit, when they're submitting collections to HathiTrust. I won't go into detail, all of the details about ingest today. I just wanted to emphasize where we get our metadata and our content from. If you are interested in knowing more about adding stuff to HathiTrust, you can use this URL at the bottom, and these slides and the presentation, these slides will be available, and a recording of the presentation will be available after today. Okay, now this is a scary table, and so I don't expect you to have it all memorized by the end of this webcast, but I wanted to share this with you because it's the best thumbnail representation of our access and copyright policies that I can give you. So I'll try to walk you through this and highlight the most important facts. A lot of folks seem to be under the misconception that certain things are available or are not available. And it's not always, those conceptions are not always accurate. Some people think that material that is in copyright is actually viewable by members or even non-members, and that is not the case except in some very specific circumstances. So let me talk through this. We ensure that everything that's in the collection is searchable, and we provide both bibliographic search and discovery as well as full text search. So whether the work is in copyright or in the public domain, no matter where you are in the world, you can search HathiTrust to identify that volume. Similarly, we also provide text and data mining services on just about the entire corpus. Works that are in copyright, we have not been providing those services on, but that is forthcoming. So those are covered well covered under U.S. copyright law. We're within all lawful uses within that. As far as what's viewable, a principle that we have in HathiTrust is to promote a public good while making it possible for our members to do more with their collections. And so one of the ways we promote the public good is to make the collections as viewable and as widely accessible as we can. So therefore, if a work is in the public domain, it is viewable anywhere in the world where that public domain status is true, right? So if you find a work that's public domain worldwide and you're in Australia, if you're in Japan, if you're in Spain, no matter where you are, you can view that item at least a page at a time. If the work is only in the public domain in the U.S., you can only see it inside the United States. Similarly, we also have material that has been opened by rights holders, stuff that is in copyright, but which rights holders have licensed for us to open, and that material is also viewable worldwide. However, you can only download full PDFs, and for the most part, only download full PDFs of anything in HathiTrust if you are a member. There are some exceptions to that, but so much of the collection has been scanned by third parties. There are often restrictions on that material when it's been added, and therefore we only enable full download for those materials to members of HathiTrust. Now, I'll just mention there are two other lawful uses we make of in-copyright materials in the United States and where international law will allow this. One is to provide access for users who have a print disability. So if you are blind, if you are otherwise disabled and not able to read a book, or you're in need of assistive technologies because of a learning need, then we are able to work through our member institutions to provide access to in-copyright materials to you as a user. There are certain the link I should have added the URL for access and use on here. I apologize for not doing that. But information about our services around users with print disabilities can be found at hathitrust.org/accessibility. Now, under Section 108 of U.S. copyright law, we also have a service that allows libraries to have digital access to certain volumes in HathiTrust if they meet two conditions. The first is the library has to hold that item in its collection, and that item has to be lost or damaged or missing in some way. It cannot be used in its physical form by a user. Similarly, that work must also be no longer available on the market in a new form, right? So the colloquial way of putting that is out of print, but the actual law states not available on the market in a new condition. So therefore, if those conditions are met, a library can work with us to identify those works in the collection and have them made accessible to the members in their libraries on their campus. That's a lot to walk through, but just a quick thumbnail here is everything's searchable. Everything that can be viewed that's in the public domain can be viewed by anybody where it is in the public domain. Members only generally can download, and if you're print disabled or you have a lost or missing item that's off the market, we can sometimes make access available to you. So you see there a fairly complex set of interactions between what copyright law dictates and what our access policies are. Now, these next two slides give you some sense of what is open worldwide. This pie chart, it gives you a view and a snapshot of the various types of open status materials we have in the collection. So some materials, about a fifth of the collection is open worldwide. About 15% of the collection is open only in the United States, public domain only in the US. 5% or so is federal documents and open worldwide. And then we have a fraction of a percent of materials that have been opened with a Creative Commons license. Now, that fraction of a percent doesn't seem like very much, but it's actually around 200,000 volumes. So it's a not insubstantial number of works that have been opened that way. So that leaves the majority of the collection still closed, either in copyright or with an uncertain copyright status. And when we don't know the status of a copyright of a work, we will leave it closed. Now, this is another way of looking at the same information. This just gives you a sense of what is open and closed by date of publication. And I don't know how clear this is to you on your screen. The text is awfully tiny. So I'll just kind of walk you through real quickly and point out that from 1900 up to the early 21st century, So from the fourth bar over from the left, that's all decade by decade publication dates. Okay, and then before 1900, I've collapsed a number of decades together to give you a sense of the volume. The dark colored parts of the bars are materials that are in copyright or otherwise closed, and the orange or lighter colored parts of the bars are open or in the public domain. So you can see here some very clear trends. One is that there has been an awful lot more published in the 20th century and collected by libraries in the 20th century than we had seen before. And you can also clearly see the impact of extended copyright terms on this collection here, right? So anything, 60% of the collections published after 1950, and most of what you see in that collection is probably going to be federal documents. That's certainly true after 1970, that most of what is orange or light is probably a US federal document or opened by Creative Commons. So I have another complicated table here, and I won't belabor this one, but I want to tell you a little bit about how we make our first stab at copyright determinations. Um, so we rely on bibliographic data. I pointed out earlier to you that members contribute MARC records when they are submitting content for inclusion in HathiTrust. So we have some algorithms that process on the MARC records and look at two factors, three actually, but one is place of publication, US or non-US, and then date of publication. Within the US materials, we'll look to see if it's a federal document. So if material has been published in the US prior to 1922, it is public domain. After 1923 in the US and a federal document, we will treat it as open and public domain. If it's not a federal document, we keep it closed. For material published outside of the US, we have different date ranges because copyright terms have a different term and a different set of criteria in other countries. So we don't, as a matter of course, open anything that was published between 1876 and 1922 if it was published outside of the US. What will do if it's 1876 to 1922, we will mark it public domain US, but we will not open it worldwide. That's clear. Anything published before 1875, we open as public domain, and anything that was published after 1923, not published in the US, we keep closed. And if we don't have date information, we just close it. We don't know the copyright status then, and therefore we mark it undetermined and it stays closed. Now, I want to make a couple of points here. Number one, we're relying on bibliographic data. And so bibliographic data is subject to error. We know that. So we do have processes to correct metadata when we are made aware of errors. We rely on our members to do that. We have good response rate on that. I will point out to you here, I didn't show on this bar chart, if you look at the very first bar for pre-1800, there's a very tiny sliver of dark down there that is closed. You might wonder, why is anything published before 1800 closed? The likelihood there is that those are items with either no copyright date or no publication date or very bad date data there, and so we've had to mark them closed until we can correct the metadata. The other thing I would point out is that copyright law is more complex than where it was published and when it was published. There are other criteria or other factors that come into play. In the US, at various times there have been formalities required and later not. There have been requirements to renew, and then those requirements went away. Outside of the U.S., the typical way that the copyright term is determined is based on the death date of the author. So all of those factors are things we can't take into consideration when we're looking at a MARC record. Those are the kinds of things that we need more human intervention on. And it's that issue, the need for human intervention into looking at the copyright status of these works, that led us to the project known as the Copyright Review Management System. Now, before we get to that, I want to stop and take questions about anything I've said at this point and try to clarify anything I may have left ambiguous.
If anybody has a question, you can type that into your chat window, please. I don't have any questions right now.
Let's give it a minute just so people can.
Okay. Does HathiTrust close items that members have previously declared open?
Does HathiTrust close items that members have previously declared open? I probably need a little more detail on the scenario there. I will say that there have been cases where we've had to close an item because of privacy issues. This is very rare, but we have found a few federal documents that were published in the 70s that included PII, or public private identification, like social security numbers. This is much the exception than the rule. But when we've been made aware of that, we've had no choice but to go close those because we don't have a system to redact items for that reason. I will also say that our access policies, I know, are somewhat sometimes different from what a local institution might choose to do. For example, we rely on fair use in very specific contexts here, but we don't rely on fair use to make in-copyright material generally viewable. And there are many cases, especially with special collections materials, I know with orphan works in particular, that an individual institution might choose to open up, say, a set of photographs of undetermined status because they determine the risk to be low. That is not something we do with HathiTrust materials. So that's my stab at an answer. I don't know if that helps.
Another question, some pre-1923 US items are not available for non-member download. Why?
So I will come back to this chart. Give me just a second here. Whoops, there we go. So non-member download is a problem for some people, I recognize. And the reason that we don't enable it for all works is that some works have been digitized by a third party who has asked us to, basically as a condition of us accepting the content, has stated they do not want it accessible except only in certain contexts. And one of those contexts is for members. So wherever we can, we will open it up. So works that are in copyright but have been CC licensed, those we will make available for full download, regardless of who digitized them. But unless a rights holder steps in and offers that license to us, we are unable to offer full download for many of those materials. I should say it's not true across the board. There are just some, in particular, Google materials have third-party restrictions on them, and those are generally not downloadable except by members of HathiTrust.
What's the process for HathiTrust to open an item that is closed for a library whose copy is lost or damaged?
That's a great question, and if you will give me until I get out of my own question and answer period, I will put the URL into the chat box so that you can get some detail.
I actually already did put the URL in the chat box. So you'll see the hathitrust.org/accessibility and hathitrust.org/access and use. I can add the one for the out of print brittle.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. Just to quickly clarify, what is necessary there is that your holdings data, which is submitted to HathiTrust annually, needs to identify those items which you have deemed to be lost or damaged. If with that in mind, we can then work with you to determine whether or not that item is available on the market for replacement. And that's work that's usually done by the member library. This is not something that's done, I will be honest with you, at a very large scale. It has tended to be only, maybe a third of the membership that's taken advantage of this. And I'm happy to talk with anybody who wants to do that to kind of walk through the process we would want used to determine availability on the market. It involves a little bit of research and documentation. So. Anything else, Melissa?
I don't have any more questions at this time.
Okay, great. Well, if that's the case, then what I'll do is unshare my screen and turn it over to Christina so she can talk about copyright review and the CRMS project. So give me just a second here. All right, I'm done there. I think you should be able to take it over, Christina.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So I'm going to talk about our copyright review projects, which started back as far back as 2007. We've had Well, first of all, I should say we started this activity because of the questions around copyright indeterminacy of our library collections. And that is because we have an information gap where we just don't know whether something is public domain or not. We realize that there's a need to look for information in order to be certain, have more certainty about what we can do with things in our collections. So this activity has been supported by 3 grants, National Leadership Grants from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Each of those grants has been focused on a particular activity. So I'll give you a high overview of the grant activity. The first one was called CRMS US, and that grant was focused on reviewing US published works between 1923 and 1963. That was a time period when US publications had to comply with formalities to continue with copyright terms, and that was such as copyright notice appearing on the work at time of publication, and also copyright had to be renewed after 28 years. So that grant lasted 3 years, and it was only an inquiry into US published monographic works during that time period. And that was also a time period in which they were testing and developing the software with which we do copyright reviews. The second grant period also lasted for 3 years. That was CRMS World. In that one, we expanded the activity to look at non-US published works, and we selected a pool based on UK, Canadian, and Australian publications. And that was because those countries we felt had similar legal regimes that we could combine them together. And that inquiry was based upon author death dates. And so for that one, for the volumes, we were looking up death dates of the authors to determine copyright status. Our third grant was an 18-month grant, and that is just completed at the end of February. Some of our work has just been completed at the end of February. That was partially to publish a toolkit of our copyright review activities. It will be coming out in 2016. And throughout that time, we were also continuing to work on the UK, Canadian, and Australian pool, which we have down to about 25,000 works now. So as we take on a new grant, there was always overlap, and we continue working on anything that still needed to be worked on to keep the copyright reviews going. So that has been like the last 7-8 years of copyright review. Just to give you a timeline of the work, I think this kind of shows a sense of how our review process has matured. So we actually began in spring of 2007, and that time Ann Carly Zenith was here. She was determining a process for searching the Stanford Renewal Database and designing a workflow. She trained people in our University of Michigan Technical Services Department to do the work, and they began testing that process. And they were doing this all by working in spreadsheets. Meanwhile, we got the first grant in December of 2008, and they began working on developing a software interface for managing the copyright workflow, because they quickly realized that working in spreadsheets with hundreds of thousands of reviews was very cumbersome. So that testing went on until December 2010. In summer of 2010, they released version 2.0 of the software, and then they felt it was ready to begin adding people from HathiTrust partners. So we went out and they trained reviewers from Minnesota, Indiana, and Wisconsin were the first people working on copyright reviews. And they were working on those reviews all the way through the end of that grant. In December of 2011, that was when the second grant started, and we sort of converted the system to then deal with author death dates instead of capturing the renewal information. It needed a little bit of retrofitting for a new process. And at that point, we had 14 more institutions join us, and our numbers just jumped tremendously. I think we were up at one point to 50 or 60 reviewers. So that was the time when we developed a better remote training system to enable people coming on and off and adding people quickly. Throughout that time, we continued working on reviews. in spring of 2014, that first candidate pool, the US Works, we got that down to 0. Now, HathiTrust keeps taking in new books, and so the pool since then has grown back up again, and we have about 44,000 waiting in there for us if we were to go back and start working on it again. But we can say at one point we got it down to 0. And then in December 2014, we started working on our publication while the review activity continued. And then March this month, the review activity is now transitioning over to HathiTrust sponsored activity. And we will have our toolkit in press. It may be released by June. It's with the copy editors right now. So I think the main point of the timeline is that with each successive activity, we have gotten faster about delivering a new process and getting the activities started. So the first one in testing it out took us three so years to test and then roll it out. And by the time of the second grant, we were down to about 5-6 months to convert a system and then roll it out to people. I think we have it down now. I would say we could get a new project running. I would give it about 2 to 3 months to get, if we had to do interface development and training people on something, to get a new pool of works into the system and working on it. So we're building upon our infrastructure and our experience, and we have a tried and true system. So all the work is staffed by volunteers. People contributed their time, part of their time from their institutions. And again, I want to call out thanks to all of them, but also the first 3 who've been with us since the very beginning, which are Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Indiana. So we have anywhere from 15% to 1 FTE currently being contributed by the institutions that they determine how much they want to contribute. That's divided up sometimes between multiple people, or sometimes they just have one person working on it at their institution. And with that level of staffing, we have been doing between 11,000 and 15,000 reviews per month. In addition to the reviewers at the institutions, we also have local staff at U of M. We have a dedicated programmer to work on our interface. We have a full-time person who had been managing the cost share paperwork for the grant and the grant paperwork. We have a full-time person to manage the copyright review work and the training and the communications with reviewers. And then we also get legal research support from our copyright office. So I think the innovation in our process is not only having an interface that people can log in and work on, it's also specific things that are part of our workflow. One of the things that really makes a difference in our process is how we define a workable candidate pool. And we are focusing on a single country of publication because that means we have a single legal regime. We can write a simplified decision tree that is sort of reducing the inquiry to yes/no answers. We have focused mainly on English language works because that's what we feel most of our reviewers have facility in, and we're only doing monographic works. Serials we have looked at, and they can get very complicated very quickly, like with adjunct materials and many authors and things like that. So a candidate pool that is not easily workable would be something like if you had a special collection at your library that contained a single, like if it was focused around a single topic, but it had publications from various countries or from various publishing timeframes, that becomes too difficult to reduce it to a simple inquiry and is more likely to be a project requiring someone with legal expertise. And we are all about having a decision tree that we can have just about anybody work on and be able to work on reviews. Another part of our process is seeking candidate pools where we can most easily locate public domain volumes. So for example, on the UK works, we're not looking at things past 1946. because it's not likely we're going to start finding things in public domain. Authors tended to die after they published, not before they published. 2 independent reviews. So each volume that we do gets 2 independent reviews. This is a very important part of our process. It's built-in verification into our system. When we have non-matching reviews, then they get adjudication by an expert at a higher level if they conflict. And another very important part of our method is to set aside anything that gets complicated, because again, we're going for the easy win. We have a lot of books to get through and we're trying to find public domain. So for example, if we have more than 5 authors on a work, the likelihood of finding all of them to be having death dates that are public domain starts reducing very quickly when you get more than 5 people. So we've kind of said if you have many, many authors on a work, for example, a conference proceedings, we're just going to say we're not looking at that. It's okay for it to stay closed. That's a review to look at again at another date. So we're simplifying the inquiry. It becomes a factual inquiry rather than a legal judgment. What we're doing here is we're bridging an information gap between the bibliographic metadata to try and reach copyright determinacy. And as Mike said previously, 2 of the pieces of information that we really rely on in the bibliographic metadata are country of publication and date of publication. If those things are not in the bibliographic metadata, then the work is not even eligible for copyright review. Our filters will not pull it in to our copyright review system if it is missing that information. So our algorithms are running off of those 2 pieces of information. And in general, we can rely upon those to be accurate, provided that they are in the bibliographic metadata to begin with. That second batch of information there, renewal records and such, those are the things that are not often in the bibliographic metadata, and we are doing the research to try and find those information pieces. Sometimes you can find author death dates in the metadata, and when it is there, that is fantastic for us. It terrifically speeds up a copyright review if we can find an author with a death date already in the bibliographic record. But we're using things like the Stanford Copyright Renewal Database to look up whether a work was renewed with US copyright. We also use VF, a Virtual International Authority File, a lot, and LOC authorities. And also, we have a list on our web pages if you're more interested in what kind of resources we use to do the research. That bottom category, simultaneous publication, state legislation, and such, those are things which currently are very difficult to determine. That information we kind of circle back around it and try to find that information, and we just haven't found good sources for it yet. But these are things, bits of data that could inform copyright determinacy, and are just, the time's just not ripe right now to find that information. So knowledge of simultaneous publication could impact whether or not a work was restored in copyright in the United States. There's no good place to look that up right now. State legislation could impact whether state government documents could be considered public domain and opened up. We've tried looking into that. Actually, Kyle Courtney is looking into that now as well, and doing some research on that. So maybe we'll hear some progress on that in the future. And we've also looked into whether we could apply open government licenses to Canadian and UK works. And the time is just not right for that as well. Needs to be more clarity around those things before we could use them to make a copyright determination. So our process, we've had quite a lot of experience, and I think we have some good insights into who makes a good reviewer through our process. We've had any levels from library aides through librarians, AULs. We've also had graduate students working on the project, and really all levels are capable of doing copyright review work in our process. Some of the things that do affect work are distractions. So this is really not work that can be done on a public reference desk in the middle of a reference shift. People have had trouble before if they are trying to work in a noisy area doing this work. But really, I think just about anybody can do the process. And we've also found that 15 to 25% is the ideal time commitment. It's an activity that kind of requires practice to keep up, but if you do it too much, it can get very repetitive and boring. So 15 to 25% is what we're recommending for how much people work on it. We train the reviewers currently through remote instruction from U of M. We have online materials. We have a sandbox practice system, which does not connect to the HathiTrust rights database, so it's perfectly safe for while they're learning. And then we also maintain some online training resources such as a decision tree and a wiki with answers that they can go and look things up, because there's so many variations in copyright review. We can't cover every instance. And so a lot of the times they're trying to make judgments of, does this look more like this? So they can email us at any time and look up answers for things that we have seen before and added to our frequently asked questions on our wiki. So this is an example of what our interface looks like. We have here a view of the book, which is coming directly from HathiTrust, page turner. And through our interface, we can flip through the front matter of the book. And that's useful because not all the information that we would need is in the bibliographic record. We do need to look at the pages. On the left side of the screen, we have a drop-down menu. It contains a bibliographic stub, and it also has resources that we have automated searches pre-populate. And this is the interface for the UK, Canadian, and Australian work. So it's going out to search VIAF, Library of Congress Authorities, NG-COBA, COPAC, and a few others. So if it were the US interface, it would be using things like Stanford Renewal Database. And then also at the bottom here, we have decision tools. So behind this runs our algorithms. All of our legal research is put into algorithms so that once the person has entered the correct information, in this case, it would be the correct author death date, the system will automatically recommend a rights code. And then we put in our notes and it will submit. So with these tools, with this information, you can do all the research within this interface and submit. And if it matches the second person's review overnight, it will then export a rights determination to the HathiTrust rights database. And if it's public domain, it will be updated to public domain view by the next day in HathiTrust. In addition to that, we also keep all the historical data on our rights reviews. So this is these are some charts of the contributions of our institutions. On the left is for the US project. The bulk of the work here being done by Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. And they have done 331,000 determinations. That's equivalent to volumes books. And of those public domain, there were 53.5% public domain. We're currently using that interface right now to run a pilot of state government documents, and that's why you see the small slivers of other institutions working on things. They are working on opening up state government documents as they can within that interface. On the right-hand side are the results from our UK, Canadian, and Australian inquiry. So institutions' contributions vary by how many people, what FTE they have contributed to the process. I know some of them look small, but in reality, even the smallest one, we're starting at 8,000 reviews. So we go anywhere from 8,000 reviews to 210,000 reviews. So really, any amount of contribution is significantly contributing to the outcome. And in that system, we've done over 271,000 determinations, and of that, 53% have been public domain. Project total, 602,000 total determinations. About 53.5% have been public domain, and of those are all opened up public domain full text in HathiTrust now. In addition to this, I'll say that on the side, we've been collecting author death dates by spreadsheet. We found people just didn't want to give up that information, even though we had no good way to capture it and pass it on to name authority records. So some people have been capturing that information by spreadsheet, sending it on to our local catalogers, and they have been volunteering their time to update name authorities as they can and try and get death dates into name authorities. So we've gotten over 1,000 author death dates to be added. Likewise, our process really generates a lot of bibliographic corrections tickets for HathiTrust. In fact, they continually ask me, when are you guys going to stop sending bib correction tickets? Just by looking at the front matter of the book, and doing thousands and thousands of reviews, we do find errors in the bibliographic metadata, and we have a workflow to put that into process and to have those errors try to be corrected by partner institutions. So that's all I've got on the copyright review process. I think we will go ahead and take questions now.
All right, Christina, I have one from Virginia Tech. Are you working at all with folks or approaches from rightstatements.org?
I don't know that we have been.
I actually can answer. Melissa Levine, who is the lead copyright officer for University of Michigan and who had been the PI on the CRMS grants, has actually been working on that project in the lead up to the launch of rightstatements.org as a participant and a partner. One thing we have not yet done is look at how to apply those in our own metadata. And it's not that we don't want to do that. It's just been a matter of time and resources since that has launched. So we're certainly aware of it, following it closely, but have not yet been able to act on any of the recommendations in our own infrastructure.
Next question, what bearing does author nationality have on the copyright review?
It has a bearing on restoration in some cases. So if a work has a foreign author, then they may not have needed to meet the formalities that the U.S. required. So we do check for foreign authorship when we're looking at U.S. publications.
And that's an important point. This is around the GATT treaty, is it not, Christina?
Right.
Yeah, so the GATT treaty has had an impact on U.S. copyright law. So treaty law basically overriding in what had been U.S. copyright law in many respects. So works that might appear ordinarily to be public domain in the United States are actually in copyright due to restorations through GATT. And it is a complex set of issues. I believe, I'm not deeply versed in this, I believe that author nationality, it varies in how it's handled country to country. I do know currently U.S. copyright law does not consider nationality with regard to the protections afforded to rights holders. So, in other words, everyone gets it. So, you don't have to be an American to be protected.
Any more questions?
Mike, I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Okay, I'll hop on over to mine. Taking just a second here, it's a little bit slow. All right. Catch up to where I'm supposed to be. There we go. All right, sorry for that delay. Melissa, if there are no other questions, I'll just proceed here so we can get to the wrap up. Let's talk about where we are right now. I think Christina gave a kind of great overview of history and process, and I will say that one of the things, before I came to work with HathiTrust, one of the things I always admired about CRMS project is the dedication to doing this at scale, doing it in a reasonable and logical way, and the rigor that has been put into the process. So the idea of doing 2 reviews with an expert adjudicating in the cases of differing opinions, that is really significant. I think it really speaks to the degree of care and import we place on copyright law with regard to material and HathiTrust. Now, as you know, as we've said, that the grant periods have the previous grants are largely done. Where we are right now is we're really kind of cleaning up the candidate pool from the last grant and beginning some planning for long range business planning for this project going forward. So at the end of February, we asked, or in February, we asked many of the partners that were already contributing to the grant to continue doing reviews voluntarily through the end of the year. And I want to say thank you to Baylor, UCLA, Indiana, Maryland, McGill, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio State, Penn State, and Princeton for agreeing to do that, because it means that right now we have over 4 FTE continuing to do reviews of the UK, Australia, Canada candidate pool. It says 25,000. We are actually making a good dent in that and should be able to complete that particular candidate pool this year. During our spare time, what we're working on is looking at really the areas, at this point, the areas of greatest opportunity and greatest possibility for us to do further review projects. As Christina has noted, there are certain things that we have to look at. We don't just say we're going to do works published in Germany. We need to narrow it down so that we have a reasonable likelihood of finding the material that could be opened. So part of the issue, as you know, probably at your own institution, if you've been participating in this project, is it's not an insubstantial amount of time. It's a great thing to be doing, but HathiTrust as a member organization and one that relies on cooperative and contributed effort is also, we need to be sensitive to the priorities of institutions and how those may shift over time. So I have no expectation that any university is going to keep doing copyright review forever. I also know, and I think you would recognize, that we have a number of other programs in HathiTrust that we're launching and have launched. These include around shared print. They include federal documents, research center. There are several others. And this project has often reinforced those programs. But one of the things we have to consider going into the next several years is how much effort we can put into a program like this and still expect members to be able to contribute in other ways. So we're really sensitive to these issues. So over the course of these next several months, we'll be doing both business planning and project planning for the future. I have this table I worked out yesterday just to share with you. This is, we don't normally show this count. Normally we show the amount of material in the collection by language, overall, the overall collection. So this is a count of items in the collection now by language that are still either in copyright or undetermined. It mirrors closely the top 10 languages in the overall collection, but I think that Polish does not show up in the top 10 of the collection overall. It just shows up in the top 10 for materials and copyright. So these are likely areas for us to do some prospecting, and we are doing analysis looking at several of these language pools, looking not only at what language, but where was this work published, what publication dates, and can we begin to get a sense of what might be possible and reasonable to do within those languages. So doing works in other languages, I'm not making any promises here. It's something that would require different linguistic expertise than what we have brought to bear so far, and would likely require partnerships and projects of a slightly different sort than what we've been able to do to date. But I do want to close with one thing that I think I would encourage you, if you're not able to do copyright review, if you've not done it, if you don't care to do it, if you've been doing it but can't do it anymore, the one thing I would encourage you to pay attention to, though, is mechanisms we have to open works in HathiTrust beyond copyright review. And I just wanted to flash on screen here for a minute a portion of the standard permission agreement that we have with authors or rights holders to open works using a Creative Commons license in HathiTrust. The URL for this agreement is down there at the bottom of the screen, and all flavors of CC4 are available to rights holders to open this material up. I mentioned earlier that we have a couple 100,000 works that have been opened in this manner. And Angelina Zaitsev, our collection services librarian, told me recently that we now have about 25,000 different rights holders opening those items up. So it's work that we really rely on you to do the proselytizing for. There's likely to be publications at any member institution that could be opened up. So I'd encourage you to take a look in the collection and see what you might be able to help with in doing so. So that's all I have to say here at the end. I did want to stop at this moment and see if we have any last questions for the afternoon before we close out.
I do have one question from Washington University, St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
Can we submit a single agreement for batches of volumes, a couple of hundred?
Yeah, that can be done so long as all of the items are being opened by the same rights holder. So we would attach, we've done that in the past, we would attach probably HathiTrust ID numbers to that agreement at the very least. But yes, that can be done. It's probably best to ask and clarify any further questions before you do that, though. So.
I have another question. Who scans the books?
That varies. Probably 95% of the collection has been scanned by Google, with the remainder of the 5%, probably 4 to 4.5 by Internet Archive, and the remainder by individual libraries. It really does vary. We have a number of libraries and organizations that have contributed their own scans to the collection. So it really does vary, but the schools that we still think of this as being the responsibility of the members to put stuff into HathiTrust. Even if they are a Google Library School, they still have to give permission to us to download on their behalf and put it into HathiTrust.
Sorry, how does an individual volunteer become a reviewer?
That's a great question. I have to say that right now we need to have the institution on board with the project. So unfortunately, and the reason for that is that there are legal issues at play here, right? The institution is committing to working with the staff, train them, ensure they're trained, and we've not been in a position to take volunteers who aren't institutionally affiliated. Unfortunately, I would really like to be able to do that, but so far we haven't been able to do so. I won't rule that out going forward, but I don't have a time horizon for that right now.
Any more questions?
Before we go, I wanted to flash this on the screen briefly here at the very end. My email address and Christina's email address are both here on the screen. There's also a preferred message or email address to use if you have a question, a problem, any issues that you need to have addressed. We encourage you to send it to feedback@issues.hathitrust.org. That goes into our ticketing system. They're all tracked, they're all referred, and they're all monitored. There's also 2 websites here where you can get detail on the CRMS project, past and forward, and also pay attention to our monthly newsletter with updates. And you can follow us on Twitter as well.
Mike, I have one last question from Vanderbilt. Does the HathiTrust agreement vary from institution to institution?
The HathiTrust agreement, that is between HathiTrust and the member institution, right? Not between the digitizing source. It really does not. We really try to have consistency in agreements from institution to institution. So what might vary is who has signatory authority at the institution, but there's certain terms that we have in there about venue, governing law, and so forth that we have maintained consistently across the membership. So we do not generally entertain edits, especially to things about like how content would be submitted or things like that. So no. All right, well, y'all, listen, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. This has been a lot of fun getting ready for this and talking to you about this project. And we are looking at whether or not we can schedule another follow-up webcast because this one was so popular. We don't have a date confirmed yet, but once we can figure that out, we will let people know. And that might be an opportunity for colleagues of yours who couldn't participate today to join at that time. So thank you once again, and y'all have a good evening.
Yes, thank you very much.